a large population of Windows users migrated to Linux. Surprisingly, many in this population appears to have migrated to Zorin specifically.
This was the second largest single-day stock decline in history, wiping an absurd $440 billion in market value from the tech giant, and the trend is still going downward.
Something happened on October 14th, 2025, that Microsoft's product planning teams will spend years studying as the moment their worst-case scenario stopped being theoretical.
Who are not that technical, or people who are used to Windows especially, or Mac OS.
The day Windows 10 officially reached end of life, the day Microsoft closed the door on the operating system that hundreds of millions of people were still using on hardware that worked perfectly, Zorin OS 8 launched. Same day. The door Microsoft shut and the door Zorin opened arrived in the same 24-hour window. And what followed in the 3 months after that date is the number that should be sitting on every Microsoft executive's desk as the clearest signal the market has sent about where personal computing is heading. 2 million downloads in under 90 days. Not from developers. Not from Linux enthusiasts who had been waiting for a reason to switch. From ordinary people, office workers, parents, retirees, students, small business owners who woke up that morning to discover their perfectly functional computers had been officially abandoned by the company whose operating system they had been running for years. They were not looking for Linux. They were not planning a platform migration. They wanted their computers to keep working without being told they needed to buy new hardware to earn that privilege. Zorin was there. It worked. It looked familiar. And 2 million of them downloaded it. That number is not a Linux adoption statistic. It is a measurement of broken trust accumulating past the threshold where the switching cost stops feeling prohibitive. And once that threshold tips, the direction of movement does not reverse because Microsoft releases a better update. The story of how Microsoft created the conditions for this exodus did not begin on the day Windows 10 support ended. It began years earlier with a sequence of decisions, each individually justifiable from Microsoft's internal business perspective, that collectively communicated something to users that no amount of official messaging could successfully contradict. The message was not stated directly in any product announcement or press release. It was expressed through product behavior, and product behavior is what users actually experience rather than what communications teams describe. The message was this: the computer sitting on your desk belongs to us more than it belongs to you. We decide when it gets updated. We decide what features it runs. We decide whether your hardware meets our requirements. We decide what runs in the background while you are trying to do your work. And if you want to keep receiving our protection, you will pay what we ask and accept what we offer. For years, users absorbed this message quietly. The switching cost was high enough, the alternatives obscure enough, and the individual impositions incremental enough that each new boundary crossed felt manageable in isolation. Then, Windows 11 arrived, and the incremental became structural. Microsoft introduced hardware requirements, TPM 2.0 chips, specific processor generations, minimum RAM specifications that officially rendered hundreds of millions of perfectly functional computers incompatible with the new operating system. Machines 3, 4, 5 years old that ran every task their owners needed, machines with nothing physically wrong with them, machines that could demonstrably handle the computational demands of Windows 11 were officially declared not allowed. The distinction matters. Not incapable, not allowed. Microsoft drew a hardware line in the sand and told users on the wrong side of it that their options were to purchase new equipment or accept being left behind. The language of compatibility was used to describe what was structurally a commercial decision about hardware refresh cycles. The trust fracture that hardware requirement created was real, but might have remained manageable if it had arrived in isolation. It did not arrive in isolation. It arrived as one element of a pattern that users had been watching accumulate across years of Windows evolution. Advertising appeared inside the start menu of an operating system people had paid for, not on a website, not in a free application, inside the interface of a product whose entire value proposition rested on being a tool that served the person using it. Background processes multiplied. Telemetry collection expanded. OneDrive integration redirected personal files into cloud storage without explicit consent. Microsoft account requirements made local account creation progressively more difficult through setup processes engineered to steer users toward account-linked cloud dependencies. Copilot embedded itself into Notepad, File Explorer, the taskbar, and the Start menu, an AI assistant that arrived without invitation, consumed system resources without clear benefit to most users, and resisted every attempt to fully disable it. None of these individually represents a catastrophic failure. Microsoft had reasonable business rationales for each of them. Cloud integration drives Azure revenue. Telemetry data improves product development. AI features demonstrate the return on the OpenAI investment. Advertising in the Start menu generates incremental revenue from an interface that reaches 1 billion users. The business logic is coherent. The user experience is the sum of all of it simultaneously. A computer that used to feel like a tool you owned now feeling like a platform you are managed through. That feeling accumulated slowly and then suddenly became impossible to ignore for an enormous number of users at the same moment. The moment Microsoft's end-of-life deadline made staying on Windows 10 a security risk and upgrading to Windows 11 a hardware purchase mandate. That moment converted latent frustration into active search behavior. And what millions of people found when they started searching was Zorin OS arriving at precisely the right time with precisely the right design philosophy. Understanding why Zorin specifically captured this migration rather than any of the other mature Linux distributions available requires understanding what ordinary users are actually afraid of when they consider switching operating systems. It is not the absence of specific software features. It is not concern about Linux's technical capability. It is the fear of being lost. The fear of sitting in front of a screen that does not respond the way decades of muscle memory expect, of not knowing where things are, of having to learn something new when the entire motivation for switching was to escape frustration rather than to embrace novelty. The fear that the cure will require more effort than the disease. Zorin OS was built around the specific insight that this fear is the primary barrier between a frustrated Windows user and a Linux distribution that would genuinely serve them better. And the solution Zorin chose was not to build the most technically impressive Linux distribution or the one with the most features or the most developer community backing. It was to build the most familiar one. The Zorin interface is not a copy of Windows. It is a thoughtful translation, a desktop environment that places a taskbar at the bottom, puts the application menu in the corner, organizes files in logical folder hierarchies, and makes Windows open, minimize, maximize, and close exactly the way users expect from decades of Windows experience. The visual language is clean and modern rather than dated, but the spatial logic is the same. Users who install Zorin do not experience the disorientation of learning a new system. They experience the relief of a system that works the way they expect, combined with the absence of everything that had been frustrating them. No forced account creation. No advertising embedded in the interface. No background processes collecting behavioral data for a corporation's benefit. No AI assistant appearing uninvited. No updates that restart the machine without meaningful permission. The computer does what you tell it to do. Completely. Without negotiation. That combination, familiar enough to require no relearning, clean enough to feel like an upgrade, honest enough to feel trustworthy, is what drove 2 million downloads in 3 months from people who had never planned to switch operating systems in their lives. The performance discovery that new Zorin users make is the element that transforms a temporary experiment into a permanent switch. Most people who install Zorin do so primarily to escape frustration rather than to gain speed. They are not looking for a performance improvement. They are looking for an operating system that respects their hardware and their time. What they find instead is that their computer, running on the exact same hardware with the exact same files and applications, feels like a different machine. Boot times that took a minute or more under Windows 11 drop dramatically. Applications open immediately. The system stays responsive when multiple programs run simultaneously. Machines that users had mentally categorized as slow and due for replacement reveal themselves as perfectly capable hardware that was being throttled by an operating system running enormous amounts of background infrastructure that served Microsoft's interests rather than the person at the keyboard. The technical explanation is straightforward. Windows 11 at idle runs telemetry services, cloud sync operations, update checking processes, Copilot monitoring, advertising infrastructure, and various ecosystem maintenance tasks continuously in the background. all of it consuming CPU cycles, RAM, and storage bandwidth before a single user-initiated application has opened. Zorin at idle runs the operating system. The hardware resources are available for what the user is actually doing rather than being shared with invisible background processes serving corporate commercial objectives. On newer hardware, this difference is noticeable. On older hardware, the machines Windows 11 declared incompatible, the machines that Zorin runs on without restriction, the difference is transformative. A 5-year-old laptop that Windows 11 would not install on at all becomes a fast, responsive, capable machine under Zorin. The hardware was never the problem. The operating system consuming its resources for purposes other than the user's actual work was the problem. Zorin makes that distinction viscerally clear from the first hour of use. The myth that kept Linux safely confined to developer workstations and university computer science departments for decades was the complexity myth. The belief, actively cultivated by Microsoft's marketing positioning and genuinely grounded in early Linux reality, that switching to Linux required technical expertise, command line fluency, manual driver installation, and a tolerance for hardware compatibility problems that would frustrate any ordinary user. That myth served Microsoft well for a long time. It was the backstop that kept frustrated users from converting frustration into action. Even users who were genuinely fed up with Windows could tell themselves that the alternative was worse because learning Linux was too hard. Zorin OS has been systematically demolishing this myth one downloaded installation at a time. The installation process is simpler than setting up Windows 11. Download the image. Create a bootable USB drive using a graphical application that takes minutes and requires no technical knowledge. Restart the computer. Follow a plain language installation wizard that handles all technical decisions automatically. The entire process from download to working desktop takes less time than a significant Windows update cycle. At the end of it, there is no product key to enter, no Microsoft account required to access your own desktop, no privacy settings maze to navigate, no Copilot activation prompts, no OneDrive setup pushing cloud storage before you have accessed your own files. A working computer that belongs entirely to you from the moment the installation completes. The myth's demolition is not a theoretical marketing claim. It is documented in the experience reports of 2 million users who downloaded Zorin in 3 months, most of whom had never used Linux before, and who discovered that their fears about complexity were based on a version of Linux that has not existed for years. When those users share their experiences, and they do, across social media, technology forums, video comments, and conversations with colleagues and family, the myth loses more of its power with each honest account. The word of mouth driving Zorin's growth is not being generated by Linux advocates trying to convert Windows users. It is being generated by former Windows users describing their own surprised experience to people who share their background and their initial hesitation. The broader industry implications of 2 million Zorin downloads in 3 months extend well beyond the operating system market share statistics that Microsoft monitors. Platform ecosystems operate through network effects that compound in both directions. When a platform gains users, developers find it more valuable to build for, hardware manufacturers find it more important to support, and institutional buyers find it more credible to consider. When a platform loses users, the opposite dynamics begin to operate. The 2 million Zorin users are not just 2 million fewer Windows users. They are 2 million people who are now recommending Linux to their social networks, 2 million data points that enterprise departments are tracking when evaluating their own migration calculations, and 2 million demonstrations that ordinary non-technical users can switch operating systems successfully, which is the proof of concept that was always cited as missing before. Hardware manufacturers are watching these numbers. Driver support for Linux hardware has been expanding consistently because the engineering investment in Linux compatibility increasingly justifies itself given the user base growth. Application developers are watching these numbers. The gaming ecosystem's investment in Linux compatibility through Proton and Steam's native support was driven by exactly this kind of user base growth signal. Government departments are watching these numbers alongside the documented migrations in Germany, France, and across European public sector institutions. Enterprise procurement teams are watching these numbers alongside their own licensing cost calculations. The Zorin migration is not happening in isolation from these broader trends. It is happening as part of them. reinforcing them, and being reinforced by them. Microsoft's position relative to this shift is constrained in ways that are worth being precise about. They cannot simply make Windows free and eliminate the licensing cost advantage Linux holds without dismantling the revenue model that makes Windows a viable commercial product. They cannot remove the telemetry, cloud integration, and AI features that are driving user frustration without undermining the commercial architecture that Satya Nadella rebuilt Microsoft around. They cannot relax the hardware requirements that stranded hundreds of millions of Windows 10 users without contradicting the security rationale they use to justify those requirements and potentially exposing themselves to liability questions about why those requirements were imposed if they were not genuinely necessary. They cannot make Windows feel like a tool that belongs to the user without restructuring business decisions about monetization that are central to how the company generates revenue from consumer software. The options Microsoft has for genuinely addressing the structural causes of the frustration driving users toward Zorin are limited by the business model constraints that created those frustrations in the first place. What Microsoft can do, and has been doing, is manage communications about the shift, offer selective concessions on the most visibly unpopular features, and rely on the enormous inertia of installed base and ecosystem dependency to slow the migration to a pace that feels manageable. For most enterprise customers and institutional users, this strategy will work for years. The organizational cost of migrating mission-critical Windows workflows to Linux is real and significant, and the Windows ecosystem's depth in enterprise software is genuine. But the consumer market, the individual users who make the decision at home based on their personal experience rather than procurement policies and department mandates, operates on different dynamics. And in the consumer market, 2 million Zorin downloads in 3 months is not a number that inertia management addresses. Zorin did not steal Microsoft's users. Microsoft created the conditions that made leaving feel like the better option and then removed the barriers that had been making leaving feel too difficult. The hardware requirements that told millions of users their computers were not allowed to run Windows 11. The end-of-life deadline that made staying on Windows 10 a security risk. The advertising embedded in a paid operating system. The AI features running without invitation. The forced account creation. The updates that changed settings users had configured. The background processes consuming resources for corporate purposes rather than user benefit. Each of these was a decision made by Microsoft for reasons that made sense within their commercial strategy. The cumulative effect was a user population that had been pushed far enough, frequently enough, to start looking seriously at alternatives they had previously dismissed as too complicated. And what they found when they looked was Zorin OS, familiar enough to feel safe, clean enough to feel like an upgrade, and honest enough to feel trustworthy in a way that Windows had stopped feeling for a significant and growing number of people. The 2 million downloads in 3 months is the beginning of a number, not the final count. Every person who switched and found the experience better than expected becomes a data point that reduces the perceived risk for the next person considering the same switch. Every honest account shared in a technology forum, a social media post, a conversation with a friend who asked why your old laptop suddenly runs so fast, each one chips further at the complexity myth that Microsoft's distribution model has always depended on. The switching cost is lower than it has ever been. The frustration driving people to pay it is higher than it has ever been. And Zorin arrived at exactly the right moment, with exactly the right design to catch the wave those two forces created together. Bill Gates built Microsoft's empire on the insight that controlling the default controls the market. The default is no longer controlling 2 million people who downloaded Zorin on the same day Microsoft closed the Windows 10 door. And the question Microsoft cannot answer confidently is how many more will follow once word spreads that the door Zorin opened leads somewhere better than where they came from.